This is considered a wasteland by many people, but for all of its harshness and desolation, northern Nevada and the Sierra have become home to many people over the centuries. In fact, this vast expanse of desert holds some of the oldest evidence of humans on Earth. The world's two oldest human mummies were found not far from Reno, and the tribes who have lived here for centuries left behind some of the best preserved artifacts ever found. Hello and welcome to Our West. I'm Greg Carson. Scientists say that humans have lived in this area for about 12,000 years. The natives say they've lived here forever. We'll talk more about the differences between science and native beliefs later on. Also in the next hour, we're going to meet the original Nevadans, coming face to face with a 9,400-year-old mummy, exploring the shores of the ancient Lake Lahontan, and witnessing the near extinction of the traditional native cultures. We live in the Great Basin, the area that runs roughly from southern Oregon in the north to the Colorado River in the south, and from the Wasatch Mountains in the east to the Sierra Nevada in the west. When the last ice age ended about 2 million years ago, two giant lakes formed in the basin, Bonneville Lake to the east and Lake Lahontan to the west in what is now California and northern Nevada. Over time, the 8,600 square mile Lake Lahontan dried up until all we have left today are Pyramid and Walker Lakes. You can still see the watermarks on rocks along Interstate 80 about 10 miles east of Reno. It's along the shores of that now extinct Lake Lahontan where we begin our search for life. The first recorded signs of human life in Nevada date back about 12,500 years to fragments of tools and textiles found near today's Nevada-Utah border. Although science sets a date on human history in the Great Basin, others put no limits on its origins.
There are creation stories that dictate to us that this is where we're from, that we didn't come across the Bering Strait and we didn't migrate into this area. This is a place that we've always been.
Lois Kane is a northern Paiute whose ancestors lived near Fallon, and it's in her homeland that scientists uncovered some of the oldest remnants of human life on the planet. 10,000 years ago, this desert east of Fallon was popular beachfront property along the shrinking Lake Lahontan. In 1940, some sightseers were hiking in the area known as Hidden Cave when they found an ancient burial and storage area. They had stumbled upon one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history. In 1940, archaeologists digging in one of the caves, known as Spirit Cave, came upon the mummified remains of a human. In 1994, scientists determined the mummy was 9,400 years old, more than 3,000 years older than the mummies of Egypt. Wrapped in a rabbit skin blanket, Spirit Caveman was in incredible condition for his age.
His head has hair on it, and he's got skin on his back, and we can tell by looking at the hair that it was fairly fine and wavy, not quite straight, not real thick and coarse, and very well preserved, actually. He was a relatively small man, about 5'4". He was apparently very healthy, but except for he had some very bad abscesses in his teeth, and that may have been what killed him.
Nevada State Museum archaeologist Amy Danzy says Spirit Caveman was probably a senior citizen by standards 9,400 years ago. Scientists estimate he lived to the ripe old age of 45. Danzy is only one of a handful of people who have actually seen the Spirit Cave mummy. Today it's the subject of a custody fight between the Fallon Paiute tribe and the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM. We'll talk more about that later. Although the public is not allowed to see the mummy, the State Museum commissioned artist Sharon Long to make this recreation of his bust based on the skeletal remains. The world's second oldest mummy was uncovered in 1966 at Wizards Beach at Pyramid Lake. Wizards Beach Man was estimated by scientists to be 9,200 years old, and a recreated bust of him was made also. And like Spirit Caveman, the custody of his remains are also in dispute. Both of these men lived off the abundant wildlife provided by Lake Lahontan and the surrounding land. It was a marsh environment that kept a culture alive for at least 500 years.
And they lived out in the open most of the time. They used the caves to store things and to bury the dead. And we have enough examples to indicate that they did care very much for the dead. These burials are very, very respectful and very thorough. They're very carefully buried, so we know that they, had family groups at least. The people from 10,000 years ago, 9,000 years ago, were no different from us today. We cared about our loved ones. We took care when they died. It hurt us. It mattered. We did what we could to ease that pain by doing the right thing. And that hasn't changed. People have not changed very much in the last 10,000 years.
The area where Spirit Caveman was found appears to have been an important, even sacred territory to the ancients.
The archaeologists found spears. They also found projectile points, and this is a broken one. And I'm not calling it an arrowhead because when you find it by itself, you don't know if it was connected to a spear or was it connected to an arrow shaft. So scientists call it projectile points. This one's broken. They found tools, stones to scrape off meat hide. And they even found things like ancient chewing gum.
Today, the BLM conducts educational tours of Hidden Cave and the surrounding area east of Fallon, which is considered to be one of the richest archaeological sites in North America. Thousands of artifacts were found, and after the last excavation in 1980, the site was left as it was on the final day, so visitors could see an archaeological dig in progress. The first major archaeological excavation in the Great Basin began in 1912, about 70 miles north of Hidden Cave, also on the shore of the extinct Lake Lahontan. Humans began using Lovelock Cave for storage and burials about 4,000 years ago, according to the scientific dating of artifacts. About 10,000 items were taken from Lovelock Cave in the first archaeological dig, including some of the most impressive and incredibly preserved Native American artifacts ever. Duck decoys made of tule reed that date back to the year 2000 BC. The art of weaving those decoys is quickly becoming a lost skill within Nevada's native cultures. This film, made in the late 1960s by Nevada anthropologist Margaret Wheat, shows the skill and dexterity needed to create the decoys. The weaver is a well-known Paiute woman, the late Woosie George. Another part of Lovelock Cave's historical importance is the legend of the red-haired giants.
There were supposedly red-headed giants living out on the lake in houseboats, and these houseboats were supposedly lashed together, and the Indians, the red-headed giants, known as the Sitka, they supposedly terrorized the local Paiutes, stealing their children, their women. So ultimately the Paiutes became quite tired of this and gathered together and attacked them, drove them into the cave. The Indians took refuge in the cave, and according to the legend, the Paiutes exterminated them.
Archaeologist Peggy McLuckian also says that so far there's no scientific evidence to support the red-haired giant legend. However, some of the basketry found inside Lovelock Cave has never been found anywhere else, and some scientists do believe that a unique culture went extinct here about 800 years ago. The ancients also left behind some mysterious clues about themselves. They carved and drew on rocks. These petroglyphs show animals, hunters, and sometimes symbols of a world about which today's scientists can only speculate. We do not know who did the artwork or exactly what it means, and the age is also uncertain, although it's believed these petroglyphs at Grimes Point, less than a mile from Hidden Cave, are about 2,000 to 500 years old. Grimes Point is another example of the apparent sacred and practical importance of this area. It resembles an ancient chat room, and for archaeologists, it's a veritable field of dreams, with hundreds of petroglyphs on this small slope of desert. By the time the first whites arrived in the western Great Basin in the early 1800s, there were three distinct tribes here: the northern Paiute, the western Shoshone, and the Washoe. When Our West continues, we'll meet the tribes and find out how they lived here before this was Nevada. Welcome back to Our West. The history of the American Indian is a story told from two very different perspectives. There's the white version and the version of the natives themselves. According to the white rendition, history begins when first contact was made. But according to the natives, that's when their history came to an end. They remember a time before settlers arrived, before land was owned and water rights were sold. Three tribes call the Western Great Basin home: the Numa, or Northern Paiute, the Washishu, or Washoe, and the Niwi, or Western Shoshone. The Paiute live around Pyramid and Walker Lakes and the Truckee River. The Shoshone territory lies to the east of Paiute country, while the Washoe live at the base of the Carson Range in the winter and at Lake Tahoe in the summer. They were mostly peaceful peoples who lived in small groups, usually no more than extended families. They assembled as a full tribe for big hunts, harvests, and ceremonies. The tribes had contact with each other, usually to trade food and furs. They traveled mostly on foot within their territories to where the food was plentiful, depending on the time of year. They ate the animals and plants that were here and made their homes from the materials provided by nature.
This was a place where the Creator put our people, and they adapted. They worked really well with the land. You know, they had a relationship with the earth and with all things that come from the earth and the skies and the heavens and so on.
Lois Kane's Numa ancestors were known as Toi Takaru, or cattail eaters. That's how the Paiute bands were named, according to their main food source. For example, the Pyramid Lake Paiutes were called Quiwi Takaru, after the quiwi fish. Their relationship with nature is sacred.
In the Paiute culture and tradition, no one person or people own the earth. In our belief, in the way we believe, we were placed here for our purpose, and that was to take care of course, the Mother Earth.
The other Great Basin tribes hold similar beliefs. By taking care of nature, they take care of themselves. Hunting and harvesting seasons were all treated as religious events. The annual fall pine nut harvest was crucial to the Numa, Niwi, and Washishu. In the 1968 Western Artist Corporation film Washoe, Washishu tribal members chant and dance through the night in the traditional pine nut harvest ceremony that's been held for thousands of years.
Listen, my people, we're here together on this ground because we live here. Don't put your children to bed. Keep them awake, because this is pine nut time, because this is good for all of us. Be happy and dance, dance well, because, oh, these dances of ours are becoming less and less frequent. Be good to your children, to each other. Pray to the Creator.
Hunting was another essential and ceremonial part of native life. The Western Great Basin offered a variety of animals for food: deer, rabbits, ducks, and fish, to name the most popular. Bows and arrows, spears, and snares were the weapons. And for the duck hunt, the natives lured the birds to land with decoys made of tule, then chased them into nets where they'd become tangled and easy for the hunters to catch. Hunts were usually done in groups with rules of conduct and rituals of prayer, thanks, and forgiveness for the lives taken. In the film Rabbit Boss by the University of Nevada Oral History Program, a traditional rabbit hunt is remembered by Marvin Dressler, a Washoe tribal elder who led hunts when he was younger.
Long time ago, before they having gun, they used to use stick, hit rabbit and kill them that way. And they make a brush, they call it gado, and round, and then they chase him in there, then a woman go over there and kill him, knock him down. And whatever gets out, why, they let him go,
With the belief that every life is sacred, the natives learned to use every part of their prey. Rabbit skins were made into warm, durable blankets and robes. Hunting is what separated the men from the boys in native Nevada. A boy's first deer kill was often his rite of passage into manhood. A special ceremony also marked a young girl's passage to womanhood. For example, in Washoe tradition, the young woman fasted for 4 days. On the 4th night, she would climb to the top of a mountain with one of her relatives. There they lit 4 fires to announce this important time and to invite everyone to a big dance and ceremony the next day. Whether it was sewing skins, tanning hides, or building shelters, it was often the women of the tribe who got the job done. One of the most distinctive and enduring features of the Great Basin Indians is the basketry, which is found nowhere else in the world. Pottery was too delicate to carry on their rough and frequent journeys through the desert, so instead they made their containers for everything from water to children with tule reeds and willows found in the marshes. These incredibly durable baskets and mats have held up over centuries, providing scientists with some of the best evidence of ancient cultures. 4,000-year-old tule matting was found in Lovelock Cave and in the burial of the 9,400-year-old Spirit Cave mummy. The particular design of a basket became a signature for each tribe and individual weaver.
You can look at a basket roughly and tell the tribe of the maker.
Datsolali was a famous Washoe basket maker who was born in 1835. Her most famous piece took 2 years to complete and is made with more than 84,000 tightly woven stitches. Today, Datsolali baskets are worth tens of thousands of dollars and can be seen in museums around the world. Plants were also the building materials the Great Basin Indians used for their homes. Whether they were teepees, kanis, or galas dungals, the shelters were all built essentially like the one these local Paiute women are building in this film by anthropologist Margaret Wheat. When it comes to language, there's a distinct difference between the 3 western Great Basin tribes. Although the northern Paiute and western Shoshone languages are related, as similar as Spanish is to Italian, the Washoe language is entirely different, related instead to tribes in California. Petroglyphs are one of the few examples of written communication among the Great Basin Indians. Instead, the laws, ideas, and history of the natives are passed on through the spoken word. Legends are used to teach, inform, and explain the ways of each tribe. Listen to the Stone Mother legend of Kuyuipa, or Pyramid Lake.
The mother and father had a family of 4 sons, but there was so much internal fighting within the family that the sons were instructed to leave. And they went to the 4 directions, and they were told to come back and light a signal fire when they were actually ready to come back to make peace within the family. Well, the story goes on that the mother was so aggrieved by her family splitting and not getting any type of indication when they were going to be coming back, so she started crying, and her tears essentially because of the salt water. That's how Pyramid Lake was formed.
The other tribes also had crucial water supplies they considered sacred. For the Niwi, western Shoshone, it was the Humboldt River. And for the Washoe, it was Da'awaga, or Lake Tahoe.
That was the heart of the Washoe people. And any place a stream came into that lake, we were there. And you look at the development up there, you know, and it's totally been destroyed.
The native legends have allowed today's tribes to keep their histories alive, even though their way of life, which had lasted for thousands of years, would be erased in less than 50. The pioneers arrive in the Great Basin when our West continues. For several centuries, life here in the western Great Basin didn't change much. Native tribes went about their business pretty much the same year after year. But in the early 1800s, something happened that would change things here forever. Jedediah Smith is generally given credit for leading the first white men into the western Great Basin. He and some other fur trappers crossed the Sierra Nevada in 1826. Although few Indians actually saw Smith's party, it didn't take long for word to spread among the tribes.
According to their beliefs, they believe that that was their long-lost brothers that were sent away a long time ago.
By the time the natives realized their trust had been misplaced, it was too late. The first wagon trains of white settlers were moving west in 1841. By 1845, the western migration was in full flight. The pioneers' path would become known as the Immigrant Trail, and it cut a destructive swath through Shoshone and Paiute country.
Any of the groups that were along the Humboldt basically saw all of their lands and resources destroyed for as much as 10 miles on either side of that road, because you know you're getting like 40,000 people coming down that trail, and that means their livestock and everything else has to eat, and they pretty well devastated that whole area, and they did it for several years.
But that was only a prelude of what was to come for the Great Basin Indians. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, a flood of people washed westward. And when Nevada's Comstock lode turned up in 1859, the invasion was complete. The natives were suddenly the outsiders, and no tribe was left out more than the smallest.
The Washoe tribe fared quite badly because their lands were usurped very rapidly, and they were pushed to the margins. And since they were not a warlike people, they did, of course, raid occasionally, and they did kill some settlers, but they weren't considered a menace or a big problem. And so the government more or less ignored them.
There's even documents that are saying that the Washoe tribe were not going to get a reservation because we were expected to go extinct. There are federal agencies signed that the Washoes don't need reservations, they're not going to be here much longer.
The chilling prediction of extinction also applied to Washoe lands. The forest around Lake Tahoe was clear-cut to supply timber for the mines in the Comstock. And unlike the Paiute and Shoshone, who had land set aside by the government for reservations, the Washishu were now relegated to living on the edges of towns and ranches.
They didn't even consider the Indian people human. You know, it was... I can't talk that. No, this brings too much pain in. I can't.
The emotional wounds are still raw for many American Indians as they try to succeed in today's society while they struggle to save their native culture. Nevada's first Indian reservations were established in 1859, one at Pyramid Lake, the other at Walker Lake. The Numa and Niwi were rounded up and forced to walk, sometimes more than 100 miles, to their new homes under an armed soldier escort. The strict boundaries were foreign to the natives. They didn't know what it was to own land, and it took many years to convince the tribes to live on the reservations year-round under the watch of a government agent and federal soldiers.
No matter how much they wanted to go up and hunt, the agents were saying, no, you can't do this. You have to stay here. You have to be a farmer. We want you to be a farmer. What they wanted to do is to, you know, change the Indian into a white man.
Sarah Winnemucca wrote of life on the reservations. She was the daughter of Chief Winnemucca, a Numa leader who guided explorer John C. Fremont to California. Her mother, sister, and brother were all killed by whites. Another brother, a leader named Natchez, was put in Alcatraz prison for refusing to go along with the Indian agent's orders. In 1883, her life stories were published in the book Life Among the Paiutes.
It was early in the spring, and we were then living at Dayton, Nevada, when a company of soldiers came to the place and stopped and spoke to some of my people and said, "You have been stealing cattle from the white people at Harney Lake." They also said that they would kill everything that came in their way, men, women, and children. After the soldiers had killed all but some little children and babies still tied up in their baby baskets, the soldiers took them also and set the camp on fire and threw them into the flames to see them burn alive. I had one baby brother killed there. My sister jumped on Father's best horse and ran away. As she ran, the soldiers ran after her. But thanks be to the good Father in the Spirit Land, my dear sister got away. This almost killed my poor father, yet my people kept peaceful. Sarah Winnemucca, 1865.
The tribes did fight back. The most famous Nevada Indian War erupted May 12, 1860. The Pyramid Lake War actually began about 50 miles south of the lake. Tensions had been building between Indians and settlers for about a decade. The last straw was the kidnap and rape of 2 Numa girls by some white traders. When a Numa search party found the girls at the traders' camp, they killed the 5 men who were there and burned the trading post. When the head of the local cavalry in Carson City heard what happened, he put together a squad of about 100 men and marched towards the Indians' camp at Pyramid Lake. The Numa were waiting and won that battle easily, one of the worst white defeats at the time. But the Numa would ultimately lose the war with the U.S. government.
The Native American people probably throughout the country were very trusting with the federal government, because the federal government, of course, is making the promises, we're going to take care of you. The general Indian policy was to, again, make farmers out of the Indians, but then you take a look at here in Nevada, the lands that they were given, the promises.
The Niwi, or Western Shoshone, probably have the longest-running conflict with the federal government among the Great Basin tribes. Living in eastern Nevada and Utah, they were the first to be overrun by the invasion of miners and settlers. The wagon trains destroyed their land and took much of the Niwi food supply. There were countless, sometimes deadly, confrontations. In 1863, Congress ratified a treaty between the tribe and the government. It allowed whites free access through Niwi territory. It said nothing about the Indians giving up their land and moving to reservations. But that's exactly what happened. More than 100 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Niwi did have a claim to their original territory, starting a legal battle that continues today. Once they arrived on the reservations, most Native Americans began to make the adjustments they needed to get by under a forced and often confusing new life. But the Native spirit was still alive, and when Our West continues, we'll meet a woman who embodied that spirit for nearly a century. Welcome back to Our West. I'm Greg Carson. In the span of less than a half a century, the lives of the American Indians took a 180-degree turn. Very few people are left who actually experienced those changes, but Katie Frazier was one of them. Now, Katie died in 1991, but before that, she let a film be made of her life.
I'm 97 years old. And a lot of people don't believe me when I tell them I'm 97. They say, oh, you're kidding. But I really am 97.
I met Katie Frazier by doing some work for, just volunteer work for the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. I'd heard about her. I never dreamed I'd get a chance to meet her.
Joanne Peden not only met Katie Frazier, she ended up living with her for nearly 4 years at Katie's request.
We had no plan of making a movie. You know, I was just going to spend the summer with her. And she would tell me stories, and we'd sit outside at night. It was hot out there in Nixon, and she'd tell stories, and I'd say, Katie, this needs to be gotten down. And she said, well, you ought to write a book then.
Instead, Peden produced a movie. That Was Happy Life was the title, and Katie Frazier's way of remembering her days as a girl on the Pyramid Lake Indian Reservation.
The old-timers were real relative people, and they like to visit you, and they all eat together. And it was nice. I thought, you know, everybody all together in the evenings, and they sit around the bonfire and talk and tell each other what they did during the day and laugh. That was happy life.
Her grandmother was probably a young girl when all, you know, the first white contact was happening. And so some of the old ways were very much still in progress, like going out and looking for food, even though they worked for white ranchers and got food that way. Katie was born in a little Connie, the little willow shelter.
Katie and her people made their shelters from special willows that grow along the Truckee River. When Joanne took Katie back to a favorite place, they found it fenced off and were kept out by a locked gate.
She can't go up there anymore. And I asked her if she was resentful or if Indians just hated white people. She said, no, we didn't. She said, you know, if we had, we'd have been just killing them right along as they came in.
A long time ago, before my days, there were no fences any place. See, a bunch live here and a bunch live way out there. They never had no fence in between, but they got along. I always like to visit these old places. It reminds me of people lived here a long time ago, my people, the Indians.
Katie's granddaughter remembers her as someone who kept the past alive, but in perspective.
She always talked about remembering what was, and not to ever forget, you know, who you are or what you've done and what your people knew and what they were about. But you also had to move with the changes. She was very ethical and had lots of friends in both worlds, the white world and the Indian world, and I thought she was just a great human being. She taught me about life and about death, too. I was with her when she died. And I'm working on a part 2 right now. And she talks about how her mother told her, if you have a happy life and you're a good person, you'll have a happy death. And Katie did.
Proceeds from the sale of the film That Was Happy Life go to a scholarship fund created on behalf of Katie Frazier that helps local Native American students attend the University of Nevada. Katie herself attended school in a place where Native Americans were forced to go to give up their culture. The opening of the Stewart Indian School and life in the 20th century when Our West continues. By the turn of the century, the defeat of the American Indians was complete. The tribes no longer lived as they had just 50 years earlier. The land that had no fences was now sectioned off and sold. The tribes themselves were consolidated on reservations and told to give up their lives as hunters and gatherers and become farmers. Next, the federal government set out to Americanize the natives, starting with the children.
Stewart Indian School was a boarding school. They'd put you in the boarding school and you could not speak your language. You were punished for speaking your language. You were punished for following your own culture, everything that you were taught.
In 1890, the Carson Indian School opened on the outskirts of Carson City. It was later renamed the Stewart Indian School after Nevada's U.S. Senator William Stewart. It was one of several re-education centers set up by the federal government to teach English and white culture to American Indians. Attendance was not optional.
The children or their parents didn't know English, and so they were abducted, and they had no clue what was happening, where they were going. The parents would follow, and at some points in the school's history, the parents would camp out here by the school to be near their children.
Katie Frazier remembers being taken to Stewart Indian School when she was 8 years old.
I yelled loud when my mother left me there and walked out. I was yelling and crying and jumping around. Yet I got over that. I couldn't talk English when I went there, and that was hard.
It was very military. They wore uniforms, they had to march, they were forbidden to speak their own language or practice any traditional practices. They were beaten if they did. The laws allowed the system at the time to beat them, and then a lot of times the children died, if not from the beatings, from the lack of medical attention because they were considered unclean.
Like so many of the changes forced upon them, the tribes made the best of the Stewart Indian School. Although they could attend Nevada public schools after World War II, many Indian students chose to attend Stewart. It was a place where they could learn and be together. But once the tribes had turned that tragedy into opportunity, the government closed the school in 1980. By the early 1900s, most of the remaining American Indian tribes were under government watch on reservations. In 1911, the last Indians who refused to live on a reservation were massacred in Humboldt County, Nevada. Shoshone Mike and about 12 of his extended family members were killed by a posse out of Elko. The band had been accused of killing 4 ranch hands, although there was no hard proof of that. Only 4 children survived the Little High Rock massacre.
The original idea was to try to convince all Indian people to go to these few select locations, but they refused to do so, quite rightfully. As they said, our ancestors are buried here in this soil. We don't want to leave. We don't want to go live someplace else in someone else's land and be away from our ancestors and our area. So basically they stayed in place, and there wasn't much the government could do about that.
Indian camps were common on the outskirts of cities and towns throughout northern Nevada, so rather than try to force them to move to reservations, the government set up a system of colonies, 10 to 20 acres under tribal authority on the edges of towns like Reno, Elko, and Carson City. Over the years, the reservation system turned into more of a child-parent relationship between the tribes and the federal government as the natives struggled with social issues such as poverty and substance abuse.
We're like babies in a sense because of the assimilation just within the last 2 generations. You know, our language is going. Our parents were forced to go to boarding schools. They were punished if they spoke their own language. So we're kind of the next generation to where we grew up learning English as the primary language. So there's a real desperate need right now to maintain that.
Maintaining a nearly extinct culture has put some of Nevada's native tribes into the center of a legal and ethical storm. Science and religion square off when Our West continues. Throughout this program, we've come to several points at which the archaeological evidence and the native legends don't agree. Now we take a look at a key issue in this dispute between science and religion, a disagreement that goes to the very core of native existence.
When we make our determination, when we make our claim, this is based on our traditions, it's based on oral history, it's based on what's been passed from generation to generation, and no one can take that from us. No one can say, no, that's wrong.
But scientists say the natives are wrong when it comes to how long they've been in the Western Great Basin and how they came to be here in the first place.
The tribes that are here now are clearly, according to genetic data, DNA, related to Asian people, various Asian people, not just one group. And that connection could be very ancient. Some of the first people coming over, they could have come over around 30,000 years ago, before the modern Asian races, developed their distinctive traits, and that's why they look somewhat Asian, but not totally.
There are creation stories that dictate to us that this is where we're from, that we didn't come across the Bering Strait and we didn't migrate into this area. This is a place that we've always been.
I don't believe that they came out of the ground here. I believe that they're related to all the rest of us. I believe that they are human beings like the rest of us, and that we come from the same origins.
But what science considers proven fact is seen as inaccurate speculation by the Indians.
There is no such thing as scientific certainty. It's a fiction. There's no such thing as racial science. So you can't go back and try to say that this was an Asian because we have conclusive evidence showing that it's Asian or African or even European for that matter.
Two very different points of view that collide when it comes to the issue of native remains and artifacts. The Pyramid Lake and Fallon Paiute tribes are both involved in legal struggles with the Bureau of Land Management over the remains of the world's 2 oldest human mummies, 9,400-year-old Spirit Caveman, discovered east of Fallon in 1940, and 9,200-year-old Wizards Beach Man, found at Pyramid Lake in 1966, are in the custody of the Nevada State Museum. The tribes say the mummies are their ancestors, and they want the remains returned to be reburied or repatriated. They also claim the State Museum has conducted illegal research on the remains. But science says the evidence shows the tribes did not evolve from the two 9,000-year-old men, and anthropologists want to keep the mummies for further study and research.
They look more generic. Spirit caveman could be almost called a generic human because he doesn't resemble any living race in the ways people, forensic anthropologists look at that. And we find that very interesting. That's one of the new things that we've learned in the last few years, is that these early people are really early people. They're not like all the modern people.
If they're claiming there was another race of people here, and this is what I've said publicly, that there is a conspiracy to validate the exploitation of our natural resources when the West was developed, when our land was taken, when our water was taken.
The battle over repatriation is attracting national and international attention, as illustrated by this April 1999 cover story in Newsweek magazine. These busts of Spirit Caveman and Wizard Speech Man are the work of artist Sharon Long. She formed them according to the dimensions and characteristics of the remains. The actual mummified remains are not allowed to be seen by the public at the request of the tribes. In fact, the natives consider even the discussion of these ancient ones to be dishonor to their memories. And when the burial sites were dug up, the Numa believed the sacred circle of life was broken, and until all the remains are returned to the earth, a spirit's journey cannot continue.
We are created by our Mother Earth, as we say it, and we go back to our Mother when we die. And our spirit continues on that journey. And if that journey is disrupted, we know by our traditions that when things are put away, they're not meant to be seen again. That's just how it is. We don't, I mean, that's like, your relatives. You mourn the loss of your loved ones, but you put with them those cherished items that are theirs. And all those things are not meant to be seen again. That's why they go into that burial. And the same goes for us.
There's a huge black market for Native American remains and artifacts, especially in other countries. Now, even the most innocent-looking arrowhead is protected by law.
It was almost a common thing. Every Sunday afternoon, you had Sunday dinner. Okay, load up the family, load up Grandma and Grandpa, and let's go out to the reservation and see if we can find some arrowheads or see what we can find. Well, what we're trying to do is re-educate and start an educational campaign to inform the public that it's against the law to do that.
A 1990 federal law called the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, gives the tribes more legal power to have artifacts and burial remains returned. But legal battles cost money.
The tribe doesn't have the money to go in and fight with these people, get into litigation, because, it would wipe us out. We have a hard enough time just surviving.
Linda Shoshone is a Washoe who says her tribal history is being dug up and desecrated more than we know.
The whole Truckee Meadows is one big Washoe site. And every time you dig up there, you're going to find something. We were there forever, until the white man came in, moved us aside, but there's still evidence. No matter, if you start excavating up there, you'll find something.
Developers are supposed to stop digging if human remains or artifacts are dug up. But unlike California, Nevada does not require developers to do an anthropological study before excavating. Repatriation is seen by some American Indians as the #1 priority for tribes and individuals. It's one of the few remnants of their past that can be saved.
A lot of our traditions have been lost. A lot of our customs have been forgotten. But that doesn't mean that we can't pick it up and carry them the way we have long ago. I look at these remains, I look at our ancestors for what they have done, what they have sacrificed in order for us to be here, and that builds, at least for myself, respect to the point of knowing that our honor, the honor that we have to uphold for them, has to be equal to that of what is going to come for our future generations.
But researchers say the ancient remains, especially those of Spirit Caveman, offer mankind answers about the origin of life.
He's the most complete example, not just of the human remains, but of the textiles that go with it, the wonderful fabric that's wrapped around him. And that was a whole new way of seeing the past, because we were able to all of a sudden put into perspective, chronological perspective, the rich texture of the culture.
The future of the Nevada mummies and other remains will ultimately be decided by the courts, as are so many issues involving the native tribes. And beyond repatriation, the tribes are looking forward to the future with a lot of optimism. American Indians in the 21st century, when our West continues. A classic vision of the American Indian, the annual Numaga Indian Days Powwow in Reno. Traditionally, these gatherings were held to celebrate harvests, passage into adulthood, and other important events. Today it's much the same, only the singing, drumming, and dancing also keep the beat for a generation trying to save its culture. Today's powwows are also major competitions, with hundreds of dollars going to the winners. And they're also a key to inspiring cultural curiosity in children.
Most of the beadwork is Shoshone beadwork.
And a lot of times the kids need to learn to make their own outfits, repair, they need to do their own sewing. And so they learn their tribal identity with their beadwork, with their style.
Bisha, Owibi, Num.
But the most valuable part of tribal identity is not so easily revived. The languages of the natives are quickly becoming known to fewer and fewer people.
It's who we are, you know. Without our language, then it's like a fifth grader wrote in one of the essays when we first started, you know, the language is who we are. If we lose our language, the Paiute language, then who are we?
Besides their identity, independence is another elusive quality for the American Indian tribes today.
We, as Native Americans, are probably the most heavily regulated people in the world. When you think about all the different federal agencies that we have to comply with as far as the regulations. You got the Indian Health Service, the BIA, every agency within the federal government that has anything to do with our lands, trust funds, and yet we're supposed to be a sovereign nation, nation within a nation.
Today's tribes are also faced with having to think of themselves as a business, or at least the owners of a business. Casinos aren't much of an option for the Nevada tribes, so they're going other directions. For example, the Washoe are getting into the industry known as Aboriginal Heritage Tourism. In 1998, the tribe took over operation of the Meeks Bay Resort on the west shore of Lake Tahoe. Now, this has always been a sacred area to the Washoe, one of their main summer campsites known as Mi Ala Aga. Today, campers still come here to relax, but also to learn about Native tradition and heritage.
We're here on behalf of a number of people that can't be here today, and we're always reminded of that in our work every day. So it's the fulfillment of dreams to return home and find the peace that tribal people had known when they traveled and lived throughout this area, and the contact they had with the environment, which is essential to Washoe existence and survival.
Today, Meeks Bay is also essential to the economic survival of the Washishu. The future holds many crucial questions for American Indians. Can they keep their languages and cultures alive at the same time they try to create new economic and social opportunities? Will they succeed in their battles with science over the remains of the ancient ones while they still struggle to assimilate into modern life?
We're just like everyone else. We're trying to survive. You know, we're trying to keep our culture alive. What little we have left, we need to keep that going, pass it down to the kids, and keep our cultural identity.
A civilization they never asked for now defines the American Indian tribes. After 150 years, they are now a force again, politically and economically, and the Western Great Basin tribes are helping to shape the future of our West. Until next time, I'm Greg Carson.